The air was thick with disbelief and shock. In a quiet neighborhood in Florida, a man once revered as a man of God, a leader and a shepherd of his community, was about to be exposed for his unspeakable crimes. On this very street, the flashing red and blue lights of police cars illuminated the night, their harsh glow cutting through the darkness. Officers moved in with swift precision, their voices firm yet controlled, as they approached the grand yet unassuming house that once served as both a home and a sanctuary. Pastor Samuel Bishop stepped out, his hands raised slightly before an officer grabbed his wrists and locked the cold steel of handcuffs around them. His face remained devoid of emotion, an unsettling calm resting in his eyes. Just hours ago, this was a man who had stood before his congregation, delivering a sermon on the virtues of faith, redemption, and morality. Now, he was being led away like a criminal, a stark contrast that sent waves of unease through the onlookers. Welcome to Lost Crime HQ, your source for gripping true crime stories. Huge thanks to my amazing viewers, especially my subscribers, for your support and encouragement. If you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for more chilling cases. Let's uncover the truth together. The murmurs from the gathered crowd grew louder. Gasps of disbelief, whispers of denial, prayers muttered under the breath of those who had once trusted him without question. Some wept openly, others stared in silence, unable to reconcile the man they had known with the horrors that were now unfolding. How could this happen? How could a man of faith, a man entrusted with the spiritual well-being of so many, betray them in the most monstrous way imaginable? And, more importantly, had the people of his church and community ever truly known him at all? This is the story of Pastor Samuel Bishop, a man whose name once evoked reverence, now dripping with blood and deception. This is the story of a horrifying descent from a preacher of righteousness to a cold-blooded murderer. How did he transform from a beloved spiritual leader to the man who murdered his own niece, dismembered her body, and discarded her like trash in a landfill? But the most chilling question of all lingers in the air like a specter of dread. Was he always this monster lurking in plain sight, hidden beneath the robes of a holy man? Or was his soul corrupted over time, warped by power and unchecked darkness? As we unravel the twisted truth behind Pastor Bishop's crimes, prepare yourself for a journey into the mind of a killer, one who wore the mask of salvation while carrying out acts of pure evil. The answers may haunt you long after this story ends. For 2 decades, Pastor Samuel Bishop was the pillar of his community. His voice echoed through the walls of the church, reaching the ears of hundreds every Sunday. His sermons, filled with fire and brimstone, left the congregation hanging on every word. For them, he was a guide, a beacon of light in a troubled world. He baptized their children, married their couples, and comforted them in times of loss. To many, Pastor Bishop was the very embodiment of faith and righteousness. But it wasn't just his charisma or his way with words that gave him control. It was his ability to insert himself into the deepest, most intimate parts of his followers' lives. He was the counselor they turned to in times of crisis, the friend they leaned on in moments of doubt. And for his family, he was no different. He was not just a pastor. He was their protector, their savior. For Samuel's younger sister, Teresa Miller, he was her rock. After their parents' untimely deaths, Samuel took it upon himself to care for Teresa, filling the void left by their absent father. Her husband, Victor Miller, respected him, though he always sensed something was off about his brother-in-law. But Teresa trusted Samuel implicitly. So, when Victor voiced his concerns about Samuel's relationship with their 14-year-old daughter, Lily, Teresa dismissed them as paranoia. She believed in Samuel, believed in his guidance and devotion to his family. But perhaps, in her blind trust, she overlooked the signs that would eventually lead to horror. Victor Miller was never entirely comfortable with the way Samuel interacted with his niece, Lily. At first, it was subtle. Gestures that, to an outsider, might seem harmless. A hand that lingered too long on her shoulder. Hugs that felt just a bit too tight, too prolonged. A glance that carried something he couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't obvious, not enough to raise alarms. But Victor noticed, and he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. Samuel had always been a presence in Lily's life. As her uncle and a respected pastor, his role in the family was unquestioned. He offered to take her home after church events, insisted she spend weekends at his house, and made sure she was always nearby during family gatherings. He said it was to keep the family close, to guide her in her faith, to mentor her. But to Victor, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like control. And then there was the night Victor walked into the living room and saw something that sent a chill down his spine. Lily was sitting at the table, scrolling through her phone, unaware of his presence. Samuel stood behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder, his fingers just barely moving, tracing patterns that seemed too intimate, too possessive. It was brief, but it was enough. Enough for Victor to know, deep in his bones, that something was wrong. His stomach twisted, a silent alarm blaring in his mind. He wanted to believe he was imagining things, that he was misinterpreting innocent gestures. But was he? He brought up his concerns to Teresa, his wife, hoping she would see what he saw, hoping she would listen. But she brushed him off with a tired sigh. Samuel is family, Victor. He's a pastor. You're overthinking this. But Victor couldn't let it go. The feeling gnawed at him, keeping him up at night. He started watching Samuel more closely, picking up on small things, the way his eyes followed Lily across a room, the way he always found a reason to have her close, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her in a way that felt different from how he spoke to the rest of the family. He tried to push the thoughts away, tried to tell himself he was imagining things. After all, Samuel was a man of God, a pillar of the community. Surely he could be trusted. And yet, deep inside, Victor knew. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know how bad it would get. Not yet. It was a quiet night when Samuel made his decision. He knew what he had to do to ensure that no one stood in his way. The relationship he had been cultivating with Lily was becoming a liability, and Victor Miller's growing suspicions threatened to expose him. So, in the dead of night, Pastor Samuel Bishop slipped into the Miller household, knowing exactly where to find the spare key hidden under the flower pot. It was a home he had visited 1,000 times before, a home that now would be the scene of his first murder. Victor was a light sleeper. He heard the creak of the floorboards, the subtle sound of movement. His instincts kicked in as he grabbed the bat from under the bed, ready to confront the intruder. But when he stepped into the hallway, the last thing he expected to see was his brother-in-law standing there, calm and still, with a gun aimed directly at his chest. Before Victor could react, the first shot rang out, followed by a second, and soon Victor Miller was dead, his body crumpling to the floor. But the night was far from over. Teresa, awakened by the sounds of the struggle, stumbled into the hallway, only to be met by the sight of her husband's lifeless body. In her shock, she didn't even register the presence of her brother. It was too late. Samuel dragged her back inside, forcing her to kneel beside her husband's body before plunging the knife into her chest, ending her life in a cold, methodical fashion. And with that, Pastor Samuel Bishop had eliminated the only people who could stop him. With his sister and her husband dead, Samuel assumed full custody of his niece, Lily. At first, she was numb with grief, unsure of how to navigate the world after losing both parents in one night. But Samuel promised to take care of her, to protect her, and the town rallied behind him, showering him with sympathy. They believed him to be the grieving uncle, the protector of the last of the Miller family. But behind closed doors, Samuel's true nature began to surface. He isolated Lily from her friends, took away her phone, and kept her home from school, claiming he could teach her everything she needed to know. She was cut off from the outside world, her only contact with anyone being her uncle. Then came the whispers, subtle at first, but undeniable. Samuel's touch was no longer just protective. It was possessive. His glances lingered too long, and his hugs became uncomfortable. Lily felt trapped. And then, one night, it happened. Samuel entered her room, sat on her bed, and whispered in a voice that chilled her to the bone, "God brought you to me for a reason. This is our secret." That night, Lily's world shattered, and she knew that the man who had once been her protector was now the monster who would take her life. Weeks passed, and Lily's fear grew, consuming her every waking moment. The nausea, the fatigue, the changes in her body. It all pointed to a truth she couldn't outrun. She was pregnant, and she knew, without a doubt, whose child it was. The realization struck her like a death sentence. There was no way out, no one to turn to, no safe place. She was trapped in the home of the man who had stolen everything from her, her innocence, her freedom, and now her future. The walls around her seemed to close in, each day growing darker, each moment filled with a creeping dread that suffocated her. Desperation clawed at her chest. She tried to reach out, whispering the truth to a friend at church when Samuel wasn't looking. But the words barely left her lips before his shadow loomed over her once again. He was always there, always watching. He knew her every move, controlled every step she took. Then she tried again, a teacher this time, someone she thought she could trust. But somehow, Samuel found out. The punishment was swift and brutal. One night, she packed a small bag, her hands trembling as she tiptoed toward the door, praying he wouldn't hear the soft creak of the floorboards. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she reached for the doorknob, her fingers barely grazing the metal before a hand clamped down on her wrist. Samuel. His face was eerily calm, but his grip was like iron. He didn't need to yell. The quiet menace in his voice was enough. "Where do you think you're going, Lily?" Her breath hitched. She could feel his fingers pressing into her skin, the pressure increasing just enough to remind her of his strength, of his control. He didn't have to say it. She knew what he meant. "You belong to me. There is no escape." That night, the locks on the doors were reinforced. The windows were nailed shut. He became more careful, more possessive. She was no longer just his niece. She was a secret that needed to be kept, a loose thread that could unravel everything. Lily's hope withered. She knew then that she would never get away. Not alive. Samuel had made up his mind. There was only one way to keep his secret buried. Lily was going to die, and she knew it was only a matter of time. One night, Lily woke to the feeling of a shadow looming over her. Her heart pounded as her uncle sat at the edge of her bed. His expression was cold, his words simple. "I know you know." The fear that flooded her veins was paralyzing. She fought back with everything she had, but Samuel was stronger. He throttled her with his hands, crushing the life from her. Her struggles grew weaker as the light faded from her eyes. Samuel watched, emotionless, as she took her final breath. When he was done, he went to work, dismembering her body, piece by piece, as if she were nothing more than a discarded object. He packed her remains into black garbage bags and dumped them in a landfill, thinking he had erased all evidence of his crimes. But he had made one fatal mistake. Lily wasn't invisible. She had a best friend who noticed when she stopped responding to messages. A teacher who heard whispers of something darker. The community wasn't blind, and they asked questions. When Lily was reported missing, the police began to look closer, and soon the walls Samuel had built around his perfect life started to crumble. The police discovered the blood in the bathroom, the broken bracelet behind the toilet, and the receipt from the landfill, a trace of Samuel's every move. It didn't take long for them to arrest him. The courtroom was packed, filled with former believers now forced to face the horrifying truth. Evidence, witness testimonies, and forensic reports painted a damning picture. Samuel Bishop was no man of God, but a cold-blooded killer. The jury didn't take long. Less than 2 hours later, the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. The judge's sentence was swift and final. Samuel Bishop, you are sentenced to death by lethal injection. As the guards led him away, Samuel showed no remorse. Instead, he smirked and delivered his chilling final words. I will be judged by God, not by man. The room fell into silence. Justice had been served, but one question remained. Had they ever truly known the man behind the pulpit? Or had they been following a wolf in disguise all along? For 20 years, Samuel Bishop wore the mask of a holy man, a shepherd guiding his flock, a pillar of the community. His sermons inspired, his words comforted, and his presence demanded trust. But behind closed doors, he was something far more sinister. A predator, a manipulator, a murderer. 3 lives stolen, 1 unborn child erased before ever taking a breath, families shattered, a church left reeling, questioning how they had been so blind. How could a man who preached righteousness commit such horrors? How did no one see the warning signs? Evil can wear the kindest face. Some believed justice had been served. Others wondered if the death penalty was too merciful for a man who inflicted so much pain. But the ones who mattered most, the victims, would never get to voice their thoughts. Their stories ended the moment they crossed paths with the man they trusted most. And so, the final question remains. Was Samuel Bishop always a monster hiding in plain sight? Or did his power corrupt him beyond salvation? Drop your thoughts below and subscribe for more true crime stories at Lost Crimes HQ.